Hello, everyone. In this, my third and probably last segment about informal fallacies, I will be discussing those that often meet with denials that there is anything wrong. In many cases, a likely retort is that you just disagree. The reasoning put forward by your opponent was sound, and you are just coming out with a fancy word salad that you don't really understand. It can happen because some of these fallacies I will discuss are difficult to understand at first. Some others feature disagreement among logicians on when it is reasonable to make the fallacy accusation, while some others seem subjective in nature. This will be more of a clinic on how to debate the question of whether these fallacies are present. Just as a quick reminder, a fallacy is logically a case of unsound reasoning that can only occur within an argument. In logic, an argument is simply a proposition of the form C because P1, P2, P3, where C is the conclusion to be established, and the P's stand for the premises or the reasons given for why the conclusion should be believed. A fallacy occurs where the reasons given to accept the conclusion, even if true, do not establish the conclusion to also be true, and we say that the conclusion does not follow from the premises given. The first fallacy I will discuss has to do with the appeal to the expertise of another person. Often in our lives, we are forced by practical necessity to rely on the greater knowledge of some other person in a particular field of expertise. A doctor, a lawyer, an auto mechanic. In academic disciplines and in debates, it may often be reasonable to appeal to the expertise of someone in another field, since our collective compendium of knowledge and theory is so vast that no one person can be an expert at everything. Appeals to Einstein or Newton in physics are common among people who are not physicists. In many countries, our legal systems have experts testifying in court to bring specialized knowledge to bear on a case where they are not witnesses. However, in some sense, this is always fallacious reasoning because it only supports the conclusion rather than proving it. And under some conditions, it makes sense to consider an argument to be invalid whenever it takes the form of X is true because a particular other person says so. The most obvious way that this procedure can go wrong is where someone appeals to an expert in one field to establish a proposition in another field outside of that third person's expertise. Let's say you have a neighbor who is a biology professor, and you argue economics with someone and tell him that your neighbor had assured you that the government increasing the minimum wage would increase unemployment. Now, you might think this neighbor is a smart man, as proven by his obtaining a PhD in a difficult subject. But as I stated before, nobody is an expert on everything. Such an argument appeals to someone's authority for testimony outside of the field of his expertise, and thus commits the fallacy of argumentum ad verecundium, or appeal to authority. In this case, the appeal to the authority of an expert in a different field may be said to be less rational than appealing to someone's expertise within his own domain. Given this, many logicians prefer to classify this as an improper appeal to authority. We often see this in a more subtle way in advertising, where we are invited to believe that this brand of cars or that bank is better in some way, because some celebrity on the screen is effectively endorsing that claim. Another kind of instance is where journalists make pronouncements, explicitly or between the lines, about politics and other areas outside of the issue of how to investigate and report on news items. Who decided that journalists are experts in politics and economics and science and ethics? Well, they did. Often, when they do feature an expert on their programs, that person is selected with great care. I heard an economist argue before that whatever they want said, they can find and hire an economist to say it. Another issue rears its head when a particular field has different schools of thought within it, rather than just a set of currently unsettled opinions. Psychology has differing opinions on many matters, especially on matters of therapy, that can be labeled as psychoanalytic, behaviorist, or third force. There was even a famous psychiatrist, Thomas Schatz, who denied the reality of mental illness. We can't resolve these issues by appeal to credentials because they all have the same degrees. In philosophy, we face not only different schools of thought, but also the problem of opinions not being settled. In physics, it makes sense to prefer the opinions of Einstein over those of Aristotle. But in philosophy, a preference for Bertrand Russell over Aristotle requires additional argument. So what are we to make of this? Should we then make accusations of the appeal to authority fallacy in those situations where the experts don't agree? Before deciding for yourself, please bear in mind that a logical condemnation is not the same as a moral condemnation. If the appeal is regarding the body of theory, rather than that person's own opinion, then the expert appeal makes sense. For instance, Bertrand Russell is more of an expert on the history of philosophy than anyone who never studied it. But where he might disagree with Aristotle, he should not be presumed correct based only on him being a man of a later time. When someone is appealed to as an authority on a matter where there is no settled opinion, the appeal ceases to give support to the conclusion. There are people who would disagree with me on this, but the accusation of committing this fallacy is effectively made whenever someone retorts that another expert believes the opposite. We are put into a situation where consulting experts will not settle an issue. There is a third situation where someone may irrationally appeal to authority. The term authority has different senses and can refer to a person or group that exercises some power over individuals. In times of a lack of academic freedom, censorship, and government bodies acting to force educated people to sing from the same hymn book, what we hear from them is only what they need to say to protect their careers. Some will not just silence themselves at the workplace to the degree needed, but also actively support the regime. In those situations, the appeal to authority is not the appeal to the expertise of the lapdog, but to his cowardice or individual tendency to no, not virtue signal, conformity signal. It becomes instead an appeal to the will of the state or whatever other entity is wielding this power. In such cases, the fallacy committed is actually the appeal to force that I discuss in my Fallacies of Abuse video. So I will sum up what we have so far by saying that the appeal to authority fallacy is committed when the person appealed to is not an authority in the subject of discussion, or when the authority is an expert on a field where such opinions are not settled, and which opinion we get depends on who you ask. This fallacy can have an inverted form where we might irrationally claim that an expert is needed, or deny that the person making the argument already has sufficient expertise to advance his claim. This is known as the fallacy of Courtier's reply. There are differing opinions on whether this should be considered a genuine fallacy. It is basically an accusation of the appeal to credentialism where it should not apply. The basic idea is that you don't need to be a doctor to figure out that you only have a cold, and your doctor does not need to be a professor of epidemiology to piece that together either. This kind of debate about credentialism is as old as the hills, but debate about the Courtier's reply got heated up with the 2006 publication of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Dawkins is a biologist who argues a form of atheism in that book, based on evolution and other theories. He received criticism in the form of him not being a theologian or philosopher, which prompted reactions from Dawkins and other biologists. In my view, the Courtier's reply is to be regarded as a fallacy as genuine as an improper appeal to authority. The premises, even if true, do not support or establish the conclusion that can turn out to be false, which is the hallmark of invalidity. The Courtier's reply fallacy is committed when someone disputes the claim of someone else based on lack of expertise, who either needs no expertise or who already has a sufficient degree of it. It is more than just a way of replying to an opponent's appeal to authority because it can occur where your opponent does not even name any person. One of the types of inductive inferences that plays a role in all of our lives is that of causality. We avoid touching anything hot because we learn that it is followed by pain. Many people in the mornings apply heat to water for their coffee or tea. Drive your car somewhere, and anything you do with those pedals or that wheel in front of you sets about a series of cause and effect relations. Much of our knowledge in the sciences is also about the establishment of causality. False cause fallacies fall into two types, with each given a Latin name. The post hoc ergo propter hoc variety occurs when a causal inference is drawn solely on the basis of one event preceding another in time. Let's say, for example, that in a primitive culture, some chief does a particular dance whenever there is an eclipse, and claims on that basis that he causes the sun to reappear. In this case, we are not easily fooled, but when it comes to medical claims, we may not turn out to be that smart. Someone who grows an ugly mole might try a different food, see the mole go away, and infer that one caused the other. Superstitious people can make these inferences as part of the broader phenomenon of confirmation bias. They walk under a ladder or have a black cat cross their path, and then anything bad or unlucky will be attributed to that event. The second variety, known as non-causa pro causa, occurs when someone is identifying the wrong cause of something. The investigation of causes falls into the realm of inductive inferences, where absolute certainty for our conclusions cannot be claimed. It is a probable inference, and the issue of when it is rational is a complicated one, intertwined with issues of what constitutes valid science and sound experimental methodology. Also, many people do not really understand what it might mean to say that A is the cause or part of the cause of B. There are two senses of the term cause, where the cause may be a necessary condition or a sufficient condition. When we say that A is a necessary condition of B, we mean that B cannot occur without A. For instance, a fire will not occur in the absence of oxygen. In this case, we can say that if not for A, we would not have had B. Oxygen is a necessary condition of fire, but oxygen alone will not lead to combustion. When we say that A is a sufficient condition for B, we mean that given A, we will always have B. Any event may have multiple sufficient conditions as a collective, where all must be present to produce it. A fire requires not just oxygen, but also flammable materials and sufficient heat. Someone investigating the cause of a building fire will generally name the source of ignition that created the heat sufficient for combustion, wherever it started, rather than stating that the fire was caused by the presence of oxygen and flammable materials. As a general rule in our lives, when we want to eliminate something undesirable, we look to discover and eliminate a necessary condition. When we want something to happen or come into existence, we look to create the sufficient condition for it, which may be a collection of necessary conditions. In general, we have the false cause fallacy, in the form of the wrong cause being identified, non causa, pro causa, whenever it is claimed that A causes B, when A occurs in the absence of B and B occurs in the absence of A. This is the simplest variety where if we know that A and B are in fact unrelated like this, we can invoke the fallacy. To consider an absurd example, let's say there was a house fire in your neighborhood, and the house belonged to a guy who parked his car on the lawn. If someone says that parking on the lawn caused the fire, you might respond that the two events are entirely unrelated. To demonstrate it, you can point to instances of people who park on the lawn living in the same house for decades without a fire, which is A without B, therefore A not a sufficient condition. And in the other direction, fires happening at houses where cars are parked in the driveway, which is B without A, therefore A not a necessary condition. Here someone may mention that the psychologist Carl Jung had an interesting theory known as the theory of synchronicity. It posits a possibility that two events can have a causal connection, even when we find it inconceivable how they could ever be related. It inspired two popular songs by the Police, one of which describes a family man having a really hard day that corresponds to movements of the Loch Ness Monster many miles away. The lesson is that we cannot infer that two events are unrelated just from the fact that we may find it inconceivable that they would be. But even if Jung was right, I say that we can, in particular cases, show the inconceivability of connection by the method I just described. I will now go on to instances where this fallacy is often committed unintentionally, where there seems to be some positive connection. The fallacy is committed when a claim is made that A is a necessary condition for B, when B occurs in the absence of A. We can only legitimately infer the cause from a known effect in the sense of necessary condition. The reasoning fully disclosed is that the effect of B has occurred and would not have occurred without A. Therefore, A is the cause in the sense of necessary condition of B. Likewise, we can only infer the effect from a known cause in the sense of sufficient condition. The fallacy is also committed when a claim is made that A is a sufficient condition for B when A is not followed by B. To disprove a causal claim, only one counterexample is required. Therefore, to show the fallacy and refute the claim, argue that one or both of the claimed cause and effect occurs without the other. For instance, Switzerland, Ireland, Iceland never colonized other countries or enslaved anyone but their own people, yet they are wealthy countries. Japan and South Korea, at least in the 20th century, have been model global citizens, while becoming first world countries. Therefore, colonizing or enslaving people of other nations is not a necessary condition of having a first world country, because the wealth happens without it. The Han Chinese and the Turks, who are the leftover remnant of the Ottoman Empire, have colonized and enslaved other people and do not have wealthy countries. Therefore, colonizing or enslaving people of other countries is not a sufficient condition of having a wealthy country either, because it fails to produce wealth. Often we deal with a chain of causes and effects, such as I mentioned earlier, that is created when someone drives the car by operating the pedals in the wheel. We can draw a distinction between the proximate cause and a remote cause. The proximate cause is the one that immediately precedes the effect upon which we are focused. For instance, an insurance inspector investigating a house fire will look to discover the proximate cause of the fire, which is the event that got the flames going. An electrical short circuit, or the owner pouring gasoline on the furniture and applying a lit match to it, are among his possibilities. Either case may be a necessary condition added to the others that, as a group, constitute a sufficient condition, and the fire can then be considered a sufficient condition for the property damage. This is an example of our tendency to look for the difference that makes a difference. Another illustration is the case where a city bus plowed through a railway crossing barrier and hit a passenger train. It was found that the driver did apply the brake pedal, but a mechanical failure occurred further down the causal chain between the brake pedal and the bus stopping. The cause gets identified with the difference that makes a difference. There is another version of causal inferences that is often known under the separate name of the slippery slope. The slippery slope argument involves invoking a chain of sufficient conditions to predict an undesirable remote effect of what may seem like a good idea to someone who does not foresee the entire causal chain. We all probably know someone who argues against whatever A might be with a long story of how it causes B that leads to C that causes D and E, and then the entire economy will collapse, and consequently a whole new form of government is going to take over the country. In everyday life, we do see this with a shorter chain, such as when someone claims that increasing the minimum wage will create higher unemployment. The proximate cause in the middle, that is argued here, is that employers experiencing falling profits will employ less people. The easiest way to break any chain is at its weakest point. Here we have an A that is an increase in the minimum wage, B that is higher costs, C that is falling profits, D that is a desire to reduce staff. I would argue against the effect of staff reduction on the grounds that employers already seek to purchase as little labor as possible at any wage level, indicating that the demand curve for labor is a near vertical line, no matter what that right-wing economics professor prefers to draw on the chalkboard. If we were to cut wages in half, not only would employers not double the workforce, many would not hire any more at all, or just enough to make accommodating vacations easier. We can say that this is an argument to the effect that there is a difference along the chain that will not make a difference, or, more technically, that something along the imagined chain of events is not a sufficient condition for the next thing. The workers can even create their own slippery slope, arguing that the failure of wages to keep pace with inflation will create a crisis in consumer spending that hurts businesses on the revenue side. Either way, I will argue that the slippery slope is not a fallacy in and of itself, although some do classify it as a separate fallacy. There is no rule that says that there must be some maximum number of causal inferences in a proposition for that proposition to be true. A false cause fallacy can occur along one or more points on the chain, but the presence of the chain itself does not invalidate it. If there is a false cause somewhere in the chain, that is the fallacy committed. To suspect this is the best way to respond to sci-fi scenarios being painted for us by an aspiring orator with a flair for hyperbole. To find empirical evidence against a link in the chain, look to the past for counterexamples, such as when a minimum wage was historically increased immediately prior to a decrease in unemployment. One of the most important cognitive skills in humans is pattern recognition. In addition to having some propositions being universally true a priori, such as all humans are animals, we may notice patterns that give us a general rule that may not be universally valid. In my experience, most people who drink coffee will add some cream or sugar to it, but not everyone. If we imagine an alien from another planet observing us, he may put this observation in his notes as a proposition starting with most but not all, or something similar. If all his observations are accurate, he will note that the coffee rule is different from the beer rule, where almost everyone drinks it straight and does not even want it served on the rocks. So sometimes we have a general rule and exceptions. In an ideal world, we would all acknowledge both and never mistake one for the other. The fallacy of accident is committed when we apply something generally true to a situation where its truth does not apply because the accidental circumstances are different. To refute a proposition that is put forth as being universally true without qualification, we provide a counterexample. One of the most famous comes from Plato's Republic, where Cephalus proposes that justice consists in paying of one's debts. Socrates counters that should he borrow a weapon from someone of sound mind who later loses his faculties and demands the weapon back, Socrates would not be serving justice by returning the weapon that may then be used against him. In the Republic, this is argued to mean that justice cannot be defined as paying of one's debts because it cannot be the essence of justice. It is relevant here because proposing it as the defining characteristic of justice involves the claim of the general rule being universally true without qualification. Here we see the fallacy of accident being committed by a general rule being applied to a particular situation where the circumstances make it an exception. The fallacy of converse accident occurs where a general rule is generated and applied on the basis of atypical instances that in reality serve as the exceptions. This can also occur unintentionally when we imagine our alien friend may be looking at a small sample of coffee drinkers where the majority take it black, because they may be in the same family or workplace where it becomes more popular than in the general population. A political example would be people who favor prohibition of alcohol on the basis of what harm it does when people drink in excess. More argument would be needed to establish that the majority who do not cause the same problems should be prohibited from drinking. The fallacies of accident and converse accident are committed by confusing a general rule and an exception. Two other fallacies are related to confusion about the whole of a thing and the sum of its parts. The fallacy of composition occurs when one draws a conclusion about the whole of the thing on the basis of the attributes of its parts. An example in terms of the parts as a collective would be that since the ships are ready for battle, so too is the Navy. Another category of the composition fallacy occurs when someone refers to what can truly be predicated to a term distributively and predicates it to a term collectively to the entire larger class to which it does not apply. For an example, let's consider buses versus cars and automobile fatalities. We can expect a bus may cause more deaths per accident because it carries more passengers who can die if the bus goes off the road or may turn over, or also because it is a heavy vehicle that can do more damage to the car that hits it. We may claim distributively that more fatalities occur in a bus accident, but we should not expect it to be collectively true of all automobile fatalities. Collectively, the many automobile fatalities that do not involve a bus might reverse the situation. In terms of being on the watch for this kind of composition fallacy, suspect it when a many other of the same type seems greater than the one being claimed to be true of a collection. For another example, the atomic bombs dropped during World War II caused more damage distributively, that is, per bomb, but all the other bombs collectively did more damage. This category of the composition fallacy is different from the other in that instead of predicating to the whole and may be true of the parts, it deals with a mere collection of elements that do not form an entity. So the fallacy of composition can be committed in two ways. The first way is to reason from some attribute of the parts and determine that attribute to be true about the whole. The second way is by arguing from what is true about a thing or group of things, and arguing it to establish it to be true of a larger collection. It is different from the fallacy of Converse Accident, which involves creating a general rule regarding all of the parts, not as a whole, on the basis of examining some of them. If someone says that some of the parts of a machine are well built, and therefore so are the other parts, it is a fallacy of Converse Accident. To further argue that the machine will therefore function well is a composition fallacy. The fallacy of division is the reverse of composition. It can first involve arguing from the attributes of the whole to assigning those attributes to the parts. That what is true of the whole must be true of the parts, where those parts are not typical. An example would be that if a particular retail chain is an ethical company and John is the store manager, and therefore John is an ethical person. The second way of committing the division fallacy is to argue from the assumption that what is true collectively about a group of elements is true about the elements themselves. The legal profession has been around for centuries, but that does not mean that any lawyer has been practicing for more than 100 years. The division fallacy deals with reasoning from the whole of something or class to the parts or individual elements of the class, while the fallacy of accident deals with reasoning from a general rule to a situation in which it is not applicable. Well, that's all for now. If you like it, check out my other videos, hit those like and subscribe buttons, and thanks for watching.